Привіт.
Привіт.
Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Я Наталка Гуменюк.
А я Ангеліна Карякіна. І сьогодні ми говоримо про нашого наступного героя випуску, трошечки незвичайного, якщо брати всю палітру людей, з якими ми спілкувалися, тому що це в першу чергу політик.
По-перше, це політик, і він з далекої країни, Венесуели, і не є фахівцем з України, і не досліджує українську війну, але приїхав до Києва. Леопольдо Лópez, напевно, один з найвідоміших дисидентів, активістів з венесуельської опозиції. Упродовж останнього десятиліття Венесуела якось старалася в умовах мирних протестів повалити диктатуру Мадуро. І наш гість Леопольдо Лópez був вкрай важливим для цього, скажімо так, активістом, хоча й був перед цим мером столиці. Революція в Венесуелі, можемо сказати, не зовсім вдалася. Там залишається диктаторський режим, підтримуваний в тому числі Росією, а Леопольдо Лópez залишається дисидентом.
Чому ти вирішила його записати? І скажи, будь ласка, що він робив в Україні?
В Україні був конгрес, який називався Crimea Global. Леопольдо Лópez і його команда, вони говорили про використання вагнерівців, які приїздили до Венесуели свого часу. Але поза тим, зараз він створює альянс проти авторитаризму, проти автократії, де намагається об'єднати дисидентів, як він сам з усього світу. Україна для нього, я б сказала так, це місце сили. Він, я так розумію, вперше був в Україні за цей час, і тут знайомився з людьми, з активістами, з деякими політиками, спілкувався з військовими, тобто використав ці кілька днів, які він був тут, щоб краще зрозуміти країну.
Ну, ми ж не будемо спойлерити весь випуск. Очевидно, що ти його питала багато про що. Просто, щоб трошечки людям пояснити, хто це. Це не зовсім, з одного боку, характерний персонаж латиноамериканської політики. Він сам походить з такої родини, ну, якщо можна сказати, блакитної крові чи не блакитної крові, як пишуть про нього, але є якимось супердалеким родичем Сімона Болівара. В чому ще його особливість і унікальність як політика?
Леопольдо Лópez став мером Каракаса, столиці, на початку 2000-х. Тоді ще, скажімо так, був Уго Чавес, але була не настільки жорстка диктатура. Це країна, в якій мер столиці – це одна з топ-людей в країні. Це той випадок, коли ти далі стаєш одним з лідерів держави. Він дійсно з такої, можна сказати, елітарної родини, де там спадок Симона Болівара і решти. Але він перемагав в різних конкурсах міжнародних мерів, як такий, що бореться з корупцією, який створює один з найбільш прозорих міст. Тобто навіть коли його тоді влада критикувала за те, що от він такий елітарний політик, все одно велика частина людей його підтримувала, бо його чинна політика була, скажімо, реальною. Він мав якісь реальні здобутки. До речі, майже в той час, коли в Україні розгортався Майдан, приблизно десь в той самий час венесуельці також почали виступати проти спадкоємця Уго Чавеса, Мадуро, були вуличні протести. Він став тим з політиків, який став голосом цієї революції, який спілкувався з правоохоронцями, якого затримували, який був один з ключових облич протесту, якого хотіли заарештувати, і він тоді, чесно кажучи, навіть сказав, що я не вийду з цієї країни, я ніколи її не залишу, і сам, скажімо так, здався. Просто прийшов, сказав, як хочете, так заарештовуйте. Він був під домашнім арештом 1,5 роки, він був 4 роки за ґратами, і що мені було цікаво, і, власне, коли виникла ідея записати цей подкаст, ми з ним спілкувалися до того, його цікавив взагалі український активізм, українська війна. Він є добре знайомим з Енеплбаум, моєю доброю знайомою, яка, власне, нас познайомила і попросила поспілкуватися, тож ми мали доволі довгу розмову. Вона мала бути про війну, а далі вона була, насправді, про те, чому революції перемагають і програють. Мені було дуже цікаво його запитати, чому венесуельська революція провалилася. Коли до нього приходив додому, коли він був під домашнім арештом, один з очільників правоохоронних силових структур міста Каракаса і Венесуели, і пояснював, ось у вас 1 мільйон активістів, ви їх вивели на вулиці, а я вам поясню, що на цій вулиці у нас снайпер, і він буде стріляти. Отут кубинці охороняють президента, отут гвардія президентська, отут Національна гвардія, отут у нас просто вдягнені люди, силовики, які перевдягнені в цивільне, які там використовують силу, тітушки. Ні, йому просто не те, що залякували, ми просто показали, що буде, де стоїть який снайпер і куди він буде стріляти. Він на той час вже не міг керувати там людьми. Було дуже цікаво побачити оцю інтеракцію, як силовики під час революції пояснювали свої сили. Коли він сказав, що я тоді зрозумів, що вони працюють як армія, вони дивляться на нас буквально не на як цивільних людей, не на як своїх громадян, а як силу, яку треба силою побороти. Це трошки інше все ж таки, якщо говорити загалом про Майдан, через ту кількість силовиків, яка була. І ще кілька речей, які, напевно, важливо було згадати про венесуельську революцію. Її дійсно підтримала потім Росія, пізніше, в інші роки, і присилав Сєчин літак з бойовиками, з тими самими вагнерівцями. Це було цікаво. З іншого боку, треба зрозуміти, що коли звільнився, він був під домашнім арештом, але зміг втекти завдяки тому, що йому допомогли його охоронці. Державна охорона, яка його
стала на його бік
і допомогла втекти. Він провів ще якийсь час в посольстві іспанському в Венесуелі і зрештою виїхав і мешкає за кордоном зараз.
Ти зрештою пояснила, чим це може бути цікаво, які паралелі, але все ж таки для тих, хто нічого не розуміє в справах Латинської Америки, все ж таки на цьому етапі війни, чим ця розмова може бути цікава нашим українським слухачам?
Зараз Леопольдо дійсно створює цей альянс проти авторитаризму. Його думка про те, що чим більше людей задіяно, тим краще. Він спілкується, взаємодіє з топовими активістами з Ірану, з Нікарагуа. І може виникнути в українцям питання, а що вони можуть зробити? Вони програли в своїх країнах. Його план, який ми, власне, обговорюємо, доволі, насправді, зрозумілий. Там від санкцій до заборони співпраці з цими режимами, допомоги політв'язням. Тобто є якісь практичні кроки. Мені навіть не те, що сподобалося, цікаво було, як він казав, що коли він говорив з дуже відомою іранською активісткою, в момент, коли вони почали втрачати, сказав, ти що думаєш, ми всі такі ідіоти, ти, я, всі активісти, мається на увазі, що всі, хто програє. Ми що, постійно маємо каяти себе, ми просто маємо зрозуміти, що ці режими дещо інші. В цих умовах, перемогти мирним протестом не можна, але ми не плануємо брати зброю до рук. Але наше питання, як ми можемо там завдати більше шкоди і все-таки якось повернути демократію. Для них, звісно, це все один альянс. Росія, Венесуела, Північна Корея, режим в Ірані. Він вважає, що можна об'єднуватися. Україна в цьому, ми не є дисидентами в своїй країні, ми навпаки та країна, яка може бути там місцем натхнення, і вони дуже чіткі. Перемога України гарантована, допоможе їм. Програш України гарантований кінець для них. Тому для них дуже чітке запитання.
Як допомогти Україні це зробити?
Не просто це зробити, перемогти. Тому що для них перемога України однозначно ключ до повернення демократії своїм країнам.
Мені здається, цікаво, що ця розмова виходить в момент, коли ми маємо рішення по розстрілах на Майдані. Суд, який тривав понад 8 років у справі розстрілів на Майдані 20 лютого 2014 року, виніс вирок 5 бійцям Беркуту, з яких лише 2 є в Україні. Їх всіх поміняли, 2 повернулись, 3 невідомо де знаходяться, очевидно, або на тимчасово окупованих територіях, або в Росії. А їх всіх, крім одного, визнали винними у, власне, розстрілах людей. Одного з них у перевищенні влади. Цей вирок дає нам відповідь на те, що саме відбувалось на Майдані. Якщо дуже коротко, вирок на 1500 сторінок, який дуже ретельно аналізує оце велике політичне поле і контекст, роль Росії, попри те, що там не було ніяких снайперів з Росії і, так би мовити, третіх сторін, які там кудись стріляли в обидва боки. Роль Росії абсолютно очевидна, підбурювання до насильства і матеріальна, боєприпаси надавалися, а інша матеріальна база для придушення протестів. Але цікаво, що наш протест, наша революція гідності мала свій сценарій. Силовики – це наші українські силовики, і сталося, як сталося, Але дуже цікаво порівняти це з досвідом Венесуели, яка ще на цьому шляху, на шляху звільнення від диктатури. Тож слухаємо інтерв'ю Наталки Гуменюк з Леопольдо Лопесом Мендозою, чи він просто Леопольд?
Просто Леопольд.
Просто Леопольд, який, як ти кажеш, має вайб рок-зірки. Я думаю, що ми це відчуємо по голосу.
Я думаю, ми точно це відчуємо. Це аудіоподкаст, але ви просто загугліть і подивіться, як виглядає Леопольдо Лопес. To start, I probably would ask, because I want to talk during this, chat on really this autocracy, Alliance Against Autocracy. And also this autumn, yes, we're fighting the war, but there was 10 years since the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, which succeeded, we believe, but it's followed by the war. But first, I want a bit like to tell to our audience, to the Ukrainians, about your path. Like how you moved from the mayor of Caracas, from a politician, from very successful politicians in 2000s, renowned globally, to a dissident. You spent 5 years in prison, almost like some four in prison and a year and a half in the house arrest. How you tell your story? Who are you?
Well, I want to start with something you said. 2014, Maidan. 2014, Caracas, Venezuela, we called for protest as well. Like here in Kyiv, tens of thousands of people went to the street in Caracas and all over, and I went to prison. I had been building with my colleagues a movement for civil resistance, nonviolent action. We were preparing to protest with discipline, and that took us, many of us, to prison. Before that, I was mayor of Caracas, and I had the hope of becoming the governor of the capital region. But I was disqualified to run for office. I had 70% of the vote, but I was taken out of the ballot because I was going to win. That was the first disqualification case for political reasons. And I knew this was going to be the beginning of a trend. And that was a very clear signal, like many others, like the shutting down of press, of radio, of TV stations, that Venezuela was going towards an autocracy. So in 2014, I was taken to a prison. Actually, I turned myself in. There was a warrant for my arrest, and I decided to stay in Venezuela, and I decided to present myself to an unjust system, an unjust justice, and I knew it was going to be years. My wife didn't think it was going to be that long. I was very clear that that was necessary in order to present the real problem that we had, a dictatorship, an autocracy. So I spent the next 4 years in a military prison, most of the time in solitary confinement. I was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment. My trial was a sham trial. It was closed. Nobody could go to the trial. I had no possibility of bringing witnesses or proof. They sentenced me because of my speeches. So the sentence against me, the judge claims that I used the art of the word in order to get people to become violent. However, there was an expert that said, no, this guy never called for violence. And then the judge said, well, he was sending subliminal messages to the people. And that's why the people were protesting violently, which they weren't. They were reacting to the repression of the people. After 4 years, I was taken to house arrest. Then I called for protest again, and I was sent back to military prison in a very cruel, solitary confinement, a very, very difficult time. Then I was sent back to house arrest. And in April of 2019, I was able to escape house arrest with the collaboration of my guards. I had to seek refuge at the Spanish embassy, where I stayed another year and a half. And at the end of 2020, I was able to escape Venezuela, join my family. I never wanted to leave my country. I breathe, I live, I dream. I have a tattoo of Venezuela in my leg. But like many others, like 8 million Venezuelans, the largest refugee crisis or migration crisis in the world, very close to Ukraine. Now I am gathering with other democracy defenders, freedom fighters, people who are facing the same problem that we are facing, autocracy.
I probably would really start with that. We live now at war in Ukraine. However, we think about, successful revolution. To be honest, there are not so many successful revolutions recently globally. And when I think about ours, I always thought that we probably, we're kind of as if we jumped into the last wagon of the moment when they were still possible. After that, a lot of autocrats really misused the idea of the mass protest. They kind of hijacked the way how the protest organized. And also there was a very different dynamic globally. But I feel that the Ukrainians sometimes, when they think about an unsuccessful revolution, they would think we did it. We succeeded. People from Belarus didn't. Iranians are struggling. Myanmar failed. We understand also that in Venezuela, there was hope, but it's not there now. So when we chatted with you a bit earlier, you actually said that, you were talking to the Iranian colleague and said, don't let us believe that it's something wrong with us. How you analyze the failure, and how would you explain also for the people who managed to success in their revolution, when it's possible, when it's not?
If we take a look at the 21st century, I think the Ukrainian Maidan and the Dignity Revolution was the only successful transition to democracy. There has not been transitions to stable democracy over the past 24 years. I believe that it's very important to understand that there is a trend, a global trend, a trend where autocracy has been growing year by year, and a trend that democracy has been in recession. We have seen movements, or popular movements, color revolutions that I like to reivindicate, because one of the things that Putin and Xi Jinping, they point out the color revolutions as evil. I think that they are the people's revolution. But if we think of the movements all over the world, Iran, Belarus, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and I can go on, and they have faced a wall of autocracies, a wall of repression, more sophisticated every time. The way they go after the people in the street, after the leaders that are leading the protest, the way they torture, the way they incarcerate, the way they go against their families, the way they close media, the way they use fake news in order for people to lose hope is very, very similar. What we are seeing in different places of the world that are very far away with very different cultures. What happened in Iran last year with the revolution that took the streets because of the women's right was very similar to what happened in Venezuela or in Nicaragua or in Zimbabwe. And we couldn't be more different, Africa, Latin America, Middle East. But when you look at the patterns, when you look at the way the regimes attack the people, the way they suffocate the expression of the free will of the people, is very similar. We have come to the realization that these autocrats are not working together. So when we took the streets in Venezuela, Putin was supporting Maduro, Xi Jinping was supporting Maduro, and many other autocracies in the world. In what way they were supporting? Well, diplomatically. They were supporting them with resources, with intelligence. The Maduro was learning some repression techniques, the same way the Nicaragua dictator Ortega learned about the techniques used by Maduro. So we are facing a global trend, and that many times is difficult to understand. If you are in your city, in your country, you're dealing with your problems, it's very difficult sometimes to think that somebody far away in the other part of the world is making a big influence in the way your country is being run. But I believe that if we open our eyes to a global trend, we can link the local struggle with a global trend. Now I have freedom fighters, democracy defenders from all over the world. Now I have many more friends here in Ukraine. We have the same sentiment, the same commitment for freedom. I didn't know what freedom was about. I really didn't. I was born in a democratic Venezuela. I was lucky to have an education. I was lucky to have food in my plate. And I was lucky to breathe democracy. But I really learned what freedom was about when I was in a cell, maybe a bit larger than the space that we are in. And I knew what freedom was because what I didn't have. I think it's very important to understand the hope for freedom many times comes when it's negated, when it's taken away from you. And that's why I believe that the people in Ukraine are fighting, and that's why the people in Venezuela continue to fight as well.
The title of this podcast is called When Everything Matters. It's named after the program I curated this year, the Literature Festival. And one of the part of the story which I was writing that a lot of Ukrainians understood why it's freedom, because for some of the Ukrainians which were in the Russian basement, during the war, they kind of very clearly understand that it's literally being locked and getting out is a freedom. So it's something we can feel. I want to ask to go on with this experience, let's say, of failure. I don't like this term, but, we still, meaning that there is still Maduro regime in Caracas. What gets your strengths? When I'm talking to some of the Russian colleagues, they usually say, we can do nothing. The regime is too strong. It felt like that in Venezuela, there was a limit you can do with that strength you have and with the backing of Russia and China. What gives you strengths and where do you, find the energy to go on?
The transitions to democracy, in a way, depends what type of autocracy or system you're fighting against. Without being an expert in any way about Ukraine, I understand that in 2014, yes, you had a very bad government that used repression, but it was a failing democracy, but it was a bad democracy, but a democracy. What we face when you have an autocratic regime is systematic repression, torture. I can tell you that I have a personal experience of burying more than 15 of my colleagues that have been killed, that have been tortured. Many more went to prison like I did and were tortured very cruelly. They do this because they send a message. Every day that we took the street, they killed 1, 2, 3 people. So the next day, less people went to the street. Then they killed 1, 2, 3 people. And then the next day, less people. When you have a license to kill in the way the autocrats are killing their own people, because this is their own people, it creates a sense of fear that inhibits the people to continue to take the streets. However, we have seen in the case of Venezuela and many other countries that in spite of repression, in spite of fear, there is always something that sparks the possibility of people protesting again. Yes, we have not been successful, but yes, we continue to fight, we continue to mobilize, we continue to speak out with less microphones. What we are doing now, I couldn't do in Venezuela for many years, even before I went to prison. When you were going to a TV program, for example, of a private channel, before going on air, production person would come and they would say, remember, you cannot say that Maduro is a dictator, you cannot talk about the humanitarian crisis, you cannot talk about the economic crisis, you cannot talk about the lies in the street, you cannot talk about the price controls. Basically, you can talk about the weather, you can talk about culture. So we come from an gradually closing society that makes it very, very difficult. And when I talk to my friends from Iran, for example, the pattern is exactly the same, but people take the street. We took the streets for months in 2014, then in 2017, then in 2019. The same way the Iranians have done it several times in several ways, the same way the Zimbabweans have done it, and many other countries. But we face that wall of repression, of censorship, of prison that makes it ever more difficult.
How was it, what was interesting for me also from talking to you and your experience, this interaction with, let's say, the other side. I'm not speaking about Maduro or, the regime, but we understand that the strength of the regime also depends on whether there would be people who will defect, who would side with the democracy, let's say like that, with the rules. In fact, in Ukraine, what worked and what I also argue is that a lot of people, went to the right side. Maybe if there would be the dictatorship, they would stay on the wrong side. But, there was this environment in which for them, it was better to defect. For them, was better to really to preserve themselves. They understood. How was it for you? Especially, you're not an ordinary citizen, ordinary activist from the street. You were the mayor of Caracas. You kind of knew part of the Venezuelan elite. So probably you had a chance to talk to the people in the military, in the law enforcement. I'm a journalist. I'm pretty let's say, low-profile person if you speak. I never had a chance in this situation to really talk to the people in power on the other side. But your story is a bit different. You
mentioned something that I think is important, the environment. The phones ring when something is happening outside. You will not have effective contact with the key people from the regime if there is no pressure. And I believe that there are two vectors of pressure to the regime, an internal and an external. In my view, both need to take place, and ideally, they should work simultaneously. And when this happens, and we have seen it several times in Venezuela, the phones start to ring in the sense that you have the possibility to reach out to the people in power because they want to be on the right side of what they are hearing, of what their kids are telling them, of what their wives are telling them, of what they sense in the street. But if everything is quiet, if everything is under the control of the regime, it's very difficult for the people from the power structure to move from their comfort zone. So that's why I agree and I advocate for external pressure, for sanctions to those who have committed crimes. In the case of Venezuela, Maduro is being trialed for crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. There are more than 8,000 cases presented at the ICC against Maduro. I believe that these people that are responsible for this, for Maduro all the way down to the people who execute the tortures, the killings, and also the corrupt individuals should be sanctioned. And I know that this is an issue of great debate, because I think some people mistake that sanctions affect the people from the countries. No, sanctions affect the corrupt individuals, affect the violators of human rights, affect the people who are killing, who are torturing. That's one thing that I believe needs to happen. And then the internal pressure, it's about numbers, it's about people. And when these two things happen at the same time, there is the possibility to reach out. I can tell you an anecdote. When I was in prison, I was sent again in a very small cell. It was a military prison. I am a civilian. So I was in a building by myself. It was a 5-story building. There was nobody else. I was alone in a very tiny cell. On the other side, there were more than 500 military prisoners. But the officials would come to talk to me every day. A captain, a mayor, a lieutenant. And then they had to put cameras in front of my cell and in my cell in order for me to be completely isolated. They wanted to support what we were doing. They said, we're with you. But there were no cameras. There were no microphones at the beginning. So they had the freedom to speak out, or at least through the bars from the hallway to my cell. But then that changed when they put the cameras, and I was even more isolated. But then I was in house arrest. And in house arrest, in another cycle of the protest, this is 2019, I started talking to my guards. One of them, a high-ranking official of the political police who was in charge of the security of my house. There were like 40 people around my house. So it was not only me in prison, but me and my kids and my wife. They said, we want to reach out. What can we do? And I said, well, if you really mean what you are saying, why don't you open my house for me to meet with the people who have been reaching out? So for a period of 3 weeks, I met with the head of the political police, with the head of the national police, with the head of a very controversial and violent group of Maduro. But I met with some military, from people from the National Guard. Some of the guards that were in the military prison with me, they also came. Why are you here? I asked them, all of them, in separate conversations. And after talking about the country, the people, the lines, the suffering, they all said, I am here because of the sanctions. I am here because of the pressure of my wife, of my kids, and those that were not sanctioned, they were there because of the fear of being sanctioned. I have a first-hand experience, kind of a human experience, on the people who are the subject of these sanctions. And I think that they can change behavior and they can create the conditions for them to move sides. However, there will be no shift in sides if there is no pressure. That's why I go back to this idea. We need to build up the pressure. Internally, it's about numbers. It's about people. And people can manifest themselves in 2 ways, protesting or voting and then protesting if the election is stalled. But it's about people. It's about organizing the people. That's what we need to do in our countries. And that's what we are working in many countries now to support the knowledge, the training of grassroots activists to become more effective. But then the external pressure is also very important.
You said something interesting earlier that, like, even from any point, the more people are better, the more support is better. That's partially the explanation while you're building this alliance against autocracy. What exactly you're building and why you think it can work while meeting pro-democracy, let's say, activists from very authoritarian places? What you can think you can do together?
So, as I mentioned, I escaped Venezuela at the end of 2020. The world was closed still. So imagine after 7 years of imprisonment, I leave Venezuela and I go to confinement. So it was at the beginning very tough. So I spent the next 4 or 5 months in confinement. But then I was able to go out and I went to the United States. I went to other places. And I started to meet people who, like me, had been political prisoners from Iran, from South Sudan, from Hong Kong, from Nicaragua. We started talking about our conditions. And we came to a conclusion that we were not only facing our local autocrat, but we were facing a network of autocrats. For us in Venezuela, that is very, very clear. And I thought we were an exception, but it was interesting and in a way comforting for me to understand that it was the same problem, that we were all facing Putin in a way, that we were all facing Xi Jinping in a way, that we were all facing the mullahs from Iran in a way. In Venezuela, we face all of them because Maduro has alliance with all of the bad states and with all of the bad non-state and criminal actors from the Cartel de Sinaloa, FARC, Wagner Group, Hezbollah, and I'm not making any of this up. All of this is supported by investigative reporting that for years have been presenting how there is a buildup of this network in Venezuela. So we realized that we are confronting this network of autocrats, but we were completely disunited. But we, at times, had the logic that if we contacted the opposition from another country, that would weaken our possibilities internally. I remember talking to a Belarusian opposition leader a year and a half ago, and I asked, what is your relation with the Russian opposition? And they said, we don't have a relation. I said, why? Yeah, and they said, because we had the hope that at some point Putin would be on our side. That was really shocking to me. We also made that mistake. At some point, we were reaching out to Chinese, to Cubans, trying to convince them that they should be on the right side, that they should be on the side of democracy. Now I realize that's impossible. They will never be. Putin, the mullahs of Iran, the Cubans, they will never be on the side of freedom and democracy for many reasons. For their own autocratic grip, but also for their kleptocratic network. For them, it's about business as well. For them, it's about profit. For them, it's about power. So they will never open the gate for democracy anywhere. It became very clear to us that there was a lot that we can learn from each other. In the case of my part of the world, Latin America, we had no contact with the Cuban opposition. We had no contact with the Nicaraguan opposition or the Bolivian opposition. Although we understand that many of the curse that has fallen on top of our country comes directly from the Cuban regime, that they have been writing the script for years. But we didn't have an ongoing, constructive, learning relation with them. We decided to create this alliance that we call the World Liberty Congress, and the idea is to gather democracy defenders, freedom fighters from countries that are autocratic. So we decided to concentrate our efforts in those countries that don't have democracy. So we are concentrating in the places that nobody doubts that are autocratic regimes. And we're talking about almost 60 countries. We're talking about more than 50% of the world population that is under that condition.
It's a bit remind me, how I for years was talking about disinformation and propaganda, but also at this stage as really, I even can say, genocidal rhetoric from the Russian media. And, wherever you start to speak about disinformation in one of the platforms, of course, you can speak about the algorithm of Facebook or, other things or misinformation. But I'm saying, look, there is a difference. There is one way you counter disinformation in countries which are at least semi-democratic. You can speak about algorithms, about how to overcome polarizations, anything. But there is a bit different things when there is a person, a general, calling to kill the people and dehumanizing and, which is really not just even the hate rhetoric, but call to death. So there are very different ways on how propaganda, for instance, would be done in totally totalitarian states and the way we have. So what do you want to do together? I read the article you wrote on this challenging autocracy. If to list the things what you're doing, it's about nonviolent activism, sanctions, we already discussed it, supporting political prisoners, which is also an incredibly important thing. Ukraine has families of the political prisoners in Crimea for all these years, and probably their support was vital. And you can do so much for them, to be honest, and so little is done to the political prisoners globally. So that's very clear. But there is some other things that engaging private sector more, not letting the private sector work in the territories where there is autocracy. Very interesting for me was repositioning of international institutions like the UN, which sometimes serve autocrats, better access for the internet to the closed societies, innovative tools to provide support, all things connected to propaganda as well, what you are doing with a Bitcoin. So I kind of listed the things, but you can maybe pick up and say what are the most important and how you suggest to work with that.
Well, let me start by the disinformation, misinformation, fake news, all of that. As you very well say, it's a very different problem to talk about those issues in the US, in Europe, in a democratic country than in an autocratic regime. Let me give you an example. In 2014, when we called the protest. I was leading those protests. We called the people to go to the streets using Twitter and Facebook. That was our only megaphone because I was completely banned from the media. And tens of thousands of people went out. Fast forward 10 years, today, the conversation in social media is completely contaminated and controlled by the regime. And in fact, not only by the regime, but also with great levels of influence from Russia. In Venezuela, if you go to the trends, some days you find some weird things like you have in Persian a tendency in Venezuela, or in Russian a tendency in Venezuela. It's like, why is this happening? Because of Russian-speaking people in Venezuela? Because Persian-speaking people in Venezuela? No. The answer to that is that the troll farms that are working in Venezuela at any given point are being put to the use of the interest of Russia or Iran. And in the same way that the troll factories from Russia are being put to the use of the interest of Maduro. When I learned that the Wagner Group had two things. They had two lines of actions. They were mercenaries that were killing people, that were doing all of the organized crime, extraction of resources in Africa, engaging the war here in Ukraine. That was one line. And then it was a very interesting surprise to me to learn that they had a factory of trolls and bots. But this was led by the same person. So if it's led by the same person, it's the same logic. The same logic that they are using with mercenaries to kill, to mutilate, to extort, and to work with the logic of organized crime is the same logic that they are using to manipulate social media. So they have weaponized the use of social media. And we see in an autocratic country that when you don't have an alternative, it's very difficult to combat. In a recent study, they presented, analyzing the social media, that the dictatorship is capable of posting over 30 million messages. And in that same period of time, the democratic sectors were capable of posting 30,000 messages. It's an impossible war because there are no resources and because many times we are alone. If we put some economies of scale, that is, if we join efforts, if we understand that we need to also create some muscle from the freedom side, from the democracy side, well, maybe we can join efforts, the Cubans, the Nicaraguans, the Venezuelans, the Ukrainians, the Iranians who want freedom and democracy, and join also efforts in different areas. That's one thing with respect to communication, fake news. But there are many other things that can be done that it's very obvious, but it's not happening, which is free and uncensored access to internet. I was called to testify in the U.S. Senate to talk about these things. And at one point, a senator asked me, so if you can tell me one thing that we should concentrate, and I said, there are many. But if you can concentrate in one thing, is to provide free and uncensored access to internet in autocratic countries.
I would ask something besides that. At the same time, compared to, for instance, 50s in the Soviet Union, we, for instance, understand that there is internet in Russia. You can have access. But people sometimes, through their beliefs, choosing the information which is comfortable for them. We see it all over the place. We actually know that there are really very adherent supporters of Bolsonaro. You already said there is a different discussion in the US, but we know there are people with a very conspiratorial thinking in the US, which live in the free country with a free access, but they have chosen that. The big issue for anybody who tried to reach out to Belarus or to Russia say that, in fact, you could, but there were independent media, but there are people who just chosen to do that. They believe. We know that dictators learn how to polarize society, but there are these extreme beliefs. There is extreme growing partisanship in a lot of societies. There are also very adherent supporters of some of these dictators. There are people who believe in the Revolutionary Guard. There are people who probably, beyond being corrupt, there would be some very adherent supporters. And sometimes they are sincere. You can discuss, whether they were brainwashed. I can now speak also about the Russian army, soldiers, something. So how you also think that we really deal with that, with this polarization? And because some people would speak that, the separation line is elsewhere. There are the values belief. There is the identity politics, which is there. So, for instance, there would be people who really so much into their belief that they are so against, let's say, liberal order that they would side with Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, or anybody else. How you think about that?
That's a challenge that is beyond the access to information. But if you don't even have access to alternative information, it's very difficult that you give people the opportunity to choose sides. If you don't have a side, if you don't have alternatives, you can choose a side. There is only one source of information. And yes, you can say, well, there is access of internet in these regimes. But the level of censorship, I can talk about Venezuela. Thousands of websites are censored, completely blocked. There are places where there is internet. But then there is another problem, especially in African and Latin American countries, that is widely access to internet. So there are territories where there is no access to internet. There is complete blackout. That also inhibits not just the communication, but also alternatives, for example, in the financial freedom area, which is very important because one of the tools that autocrats use is to criminalize NGOs, to criminalize movements, to illegalize them so they can have an account, they can have a legal relation. So there are alternatives to this with the use of Bitcoin and stable coins, and we have been using that very widely. We have learned that this is very widely used in many autocratic countries. But what is the condition for that? You need internet and you need a smartphone. It's not going to solve the problem entirely, but these are some things that can be done. That's why in the paper that you mentioned, I list several things that I think should be part of an agenda for the pushing of democracy in places where there are autocracies.
I'm not definitely challenging. I'm not there to do that. But while we, for instance, speaking about the issues like Bitcoin or things like that, where my concern coming, I do remember I was reporting a lot. I wrote a book about the Arab Spring. And I know, how we were praising the internet with all the concerns, knowing that any tool can be used in a different way. So, for instance, we know that in Crimea, where there are sanctions occupied by Russia, there is, a way to overcome the Western sanctions, the sanctions against this criminal regime using Bitcoin. North Korea is known for mining, and overcoming. We probably would expect that to be in Iran. So a lot of these regimes which are sanctions kind of learn very fast that all these technologies can be also used for them. For sure, Russia used Bitcoin today to overcome Western sanctions. Quite clear that it's happening, cryptocurrency. So in your ideas, when you're discussing the tools, what are the maybe fundamental things you write or engrave into the principle that, if excess, then with these conditions? I would be rather concerned, to think about the tool. I think any tool can be hijacked. Elections can be hijacked. Any single tool can be hijacked by the people with autocratic mindset. They really start to learn from us.
No, absolutely. You know Signal? You use Signal sometimes?
I do, yeah.
You think criminals use Signal?
Of course they do, but they probably use something else more.
So you think Signal or encrypted messaging should be banned because criminals use it? So it's the same logic. My point is there going to be a negative use of these technologies? Yes, we want to put the light on the positive use of these technologies and also understanding the negative use. Actually, I am writing a research paper now that I call it Crypto Adoption in Venezuela, Two Sides of the Coin. One of the things is to really understand the way in which cryptocurrency has been used to launder money, to evade sanctions. And you know what is really interesting? That there are the tools that make all of this very traceable because it's all there on the blockchain. However, there needs to be an understanding of the law enforcement tools to be used when there is criminal use of these technologies. But there is a bright use, there is a positive use, because if you talk to NGOs or to movements in countries that don't give the possibility of having a bank account, or you can be carrying cash in order to do this for different reasons, because it's dangerous, because it's inefficient, but there are always going to be two sides of technology, two sides of communication. So we should concentrate on how can we use these tools in the right way. So when I think of technology and democracy, I think that the core principle should be how is this technology providing independence to individuals, not dependence, in communications, in financial aspects, and in other areas.
So, Leopoldo, you're a very high-profile figure compared to a lot of street-type activists I met globally. So you have better access to talk to the probably congressman in the US or somebody else from your background. So I'm thinking whether you feel that there is a chance to do something with the international institutions, in particular the institutions like UN, and can non-state actors like you, like in Nicaragua or in Syria, participate more? Because the strength of Ukraine today, internationally, why it has more platforms? Because it's a democratic state. And of course, UN cannot tell no to the legit president of Ukraine. It's way more difficult for Syrian oppositions to come, for you probably to speak at some of the state platforms rather than for any Ukrainian parliamentaries, which is rather unique for Ukraine. Do you really see that activists are not taken seriously at UN, to be honest? The people like you have chance.
Well, I think that the UN has a structural problem. That is the fact that most countries are autocratic. They vote and they have the most votes. Even at the Security Council, you have China and Russia with veto votes at the UN Security Council. The issue of Venezuela has come to the Security Council several times. It's always been vetoed by Russia and China. And if you look at other areas of the UN, the Human Rights Council, it's really incredible to see violators of human rights being part of not only of the Council, but of the directive of the Council. You see countries like Cuba, like Eritrea, like Iran, like Venezuela, being part of the Human Rights Council, when at the same time, these are countries that are being investigated for committing crimes against humanity. So I think that there is a structural problem with the UN that is structurally not democratic. The UN is not about human rights. It's not about free and fair elections. It's really not about the rule of law. It's about its own laws. It's about its own power balance that they can strike at any given point. So that's why we want to create, very modestly, but we want to create a Congress of global voices that want democracy. You have seen how important the Sustainable Development Goals have become, right? The Sustainable Development Goals of 2030 that were approved by the UN, that then created this movement of ESG, environment, social governance, that has been channeling trillions of dollars of investment, what they call impact investment for the environment. We analyzed the Sustainable Development Goals. You know how many times in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the worldview of how the world should look like in the future, you know how many times the word democracy is mentioned? 0. You know how many times the word human rights is mentioned? 0. You know how many times the word freedom is mentioned? 0. You know how many times transparency is mentioned? 0. Why is this? Because it was drafted and approved by a majority of autocratic regimes. So the UN is really, and many times, unfit to promote what we consider universal values. I consider them, and I consider that any person in any corner of the world should have the right to live in a democratic society. And now, after living everything that I went through, after everything that my country has gone through, but particularly after meeting so many people and understanding many circumstances in other countries, I really believe that these are universal values. Again, not from the theory that I learned when I was studying, but from the practice. So we need to find ways in which these global voices could be heard.
Thank you so much for saying that the universal values. I think the first article I wrote when there was a Euromaidan revolution saying I don't use this term because I don't think there are European values. There are universal values because I don't think that my friends in Tunisia have different values than me. However, now when there is this real attempt of Ukraine to reach out to the countries beyond Europe and the US, I hear often saying don't speak about these universal values because in a lot of societies, they're not really that much accepted. And I'm saying that's not true. You maybe didn't talk to people in Iran or in Hong Kong. Why do you think that they dislike freedom? Not really. Do you think that South Koreans, adore, don't have a different values? We can speak about more conservative things connected about identity, gender, but really the values of freedom and rule of law or other human dignity.
No, absolutely. I think that is that's very important because I see many people trying to justify with a cultural argument that there are some societies that shouldn't have respect for human rights. Well, you think anybody wants their siblings or their parents or their neighbors to be killed, to be tortured? You think anybody wants to be shot down when they want to speak out? You think anybody would like that they don't have the possibility of having a say in the way they are ruled? These are the universal values. We need to simplify what we talk about when we talking about universal or at least global values. For us, and this is something that we have been discussing, it's very simple. 4 things. It's about free and fair elections. It's about human rights. It's about the rule of law. And it's about democracy. Of course, you will find different countries approaching to that in different ways. But I have not found anybody who would tell you, because of culturally, I want my human rights to be violated, I don't want to say in my future, or I want to live in a society where I don't know the rules.
You mentioned that you're trying to gather the people from these autocratic regimes so they learn from each other. And you actually very interesting pointed out a bit earlier when we chatted that when you have like 40 people who've been in prisons, who were political prisoners and dissidents, you kind of understand each other well. We do have these people, though, Ukraine is democracy. Ukraine is fighting an imperial foreign occupier. So what is the place of Ukraine in all this for you?
We have presence in Ukraine of Ukrainians in our Congress because we are absolutely convinced that this is the most important battleground between the conflict of autocracy and democracy. The excuses of Putin and his narrative and that other people I see also taking that it was because of the NATO pressure and the pressure from the West and there is somewhat justified. I don't buy that. And I think it was really an attempt to expand the imperial Russia, but also to kill democracy. Because a successful, democratic, prosperous Ukraine is a mirror to Russia. And it's a dangerous mirror that when the Russians look at a prosperous, democratic, healthy Ukraine, it's going to send the loudest message to the people in Russia. That's at the core of what's at stake here. That's why I'm here.
So what do you suggest should be done in order to help for Ukraine? What is your call?
First, to understand, try to get a better understanding, a human approach to this, because it's very different to read an article or maybe to meet a Ukrainian citizen in Europe or in the United States to come here. Second, I think we can support by bringing voices to other parts of the world of why the war in Ukraine matters and why it matters that very much to us that Ukraine wins. I have talked to several Ukrainian diplomats in the past year and a half, and it's been very interesting for me to hear several times that their effort is to convince governments to vote in favor or to support Ukraine. That's not going to happen in many countries. I mean, they can send as many diplomats missions to Venezuela, Maduro, Ortega, Díaz-Canel, Arce, Musavini, De Mulas, they are never going to support Ukraine. However, what is very different, and I think this is something very important for Ukrainians to understand, that the people from Iran, from Zimbabwe, from Venezuela, from Nicaragua, from Hong Kong, are not the same that the regimes. There needs to be a way of reaching out to civil society, to political democratic movements, to independent media from these countries where there exists, in order for those voices to be heard. If you ask me, what should be an effort, not only of the formal diplomatic efforts of the Ukrainian government, but also of the Ukrainian civil society, is to reach out to other parts of the world, particularly Africa and Latin America.
But there is another key for that, but it's our job. It's really for us to understand, to know a bit more about the societies also, not to treat the societies as such. I remember somebody of my friends was talking I hate when it said Iranian drones, because, we're Iranian fighters. We don't like to be, but we understand there are Iranian drones fighting Ukraine, but there are different type of Iranians fighting. So we feel like as if we don't have space for empathy. I have a very different idea. I think that the more bitter is your situation, that it's easier for you to understand somebody else's suffering. As you said, like if you've been in the cell, you would definitely understand the person who've been in the cell. It's not like you compare your experience, who is worse, who is better. But I think for the Ukrainians, they have their own way. There is today this openness to learn more about Venezuela, about Iran. I've been foreign reporter for a while. There was always a limited interest to somebody else's stories because we were considered that, we are busy with our own troubles. Now the troubles are bigger, the tragedies are bigger, but there is more openness exactly because we in fact understand what is war. What does it mean to have, 8 million, you said? 8 million Venezuelans outside.
Of a population of 30. That's 25% of the population of my country.
So I do think that there is a better chance, but it's like a two-way thing. While I would like you to also explain another things coming from Latin America, the left-right divide on support of the Ukraine and your profile, we do understand that it's sometimes different. In some of the countries, the opposition, progressive opposition is on the left. I'm not speaking about, far left or traditional left. It's a bit different in Venezuela. I don't know how you would describe your government. It's actually, what is a political affiliation? Where are you? And how for the Ukrainians also understand? Look, I'm not really asking about explaining that there is a tradition that, America meddled into various issues in the Latin American Soviet Union has been seen as a different sides. That we understand. But how would you explain it today and the potential of the Latin American left? And also, if you speak about the Venezuelans of different views.
I think that ideology can really make things a lot more confusing and a lot more fuzzy.
It makes.
I really don't think that this is a struggle between right and left conservatives and liberals. And following the argument that there is an alliance of autocrats, well, there is no alliance of ideology. I mean, you have the communists from China, the nationalists from Russia, the mullahs from Iran, that theocratic, mega-conservative society. And they are all aligned in their interest, in their voting, in their financing, in their kleptocracy. So it's not about ideology. When I talk to different people about the way they look at Latin America, the way they look at Africa, they try to look at the reality today through an ideological lens. And I think that distorts things very much. Maduro, you asked me how his regime thinks of themselves. Well, they are a leftist regime, but they're really not. They're really not. I mean, they have destroyed our country. Our country today is one of the most unequal societies. We are as poor as Haiti. Venezuela had at one point $17,000 GDP per capita. Today is $1,500, only aligned with Haiti, which is the poorest country in the region. And there is a mega rich class of the people who are close to the regime, mega rich. So in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, you would find today Ferraris, you would find mega luxury, you would find, but for a very, very tiny group of people. To Venezuela, like many Latin American countries, we've always been unequal. But now the distance has just grown tremendously. There is no free access to education, no free access to healthcare. There are no access to social programs that effectively change the lives of people. So it's all a lie. It's all narrative. For me, it's just very simple in order to understand the problem. It's autocracy, democracy.
Still, for instance, if you're asking, let's say, not asking, but calling for some of the solidarity from your, let's say, more democratic forces in Latin America, I assumed you might be in the very same position to some point. Then you really hope more anti-Maduro protests that, like people in Chile, in Brazil, they're closer to Venezuela than Ukrainians and Iranians. Was it also, we felt that, the protests in Venezuela, did you try to reach out, and how was your relations with, let's say, some of the left, various lefts in Latin America to support your cause, and how did it work, and what is your argument?
No, we've had very important figures from progressive left. My political party it's a center-left party. However, the regime tried to present us as extreme right, Nazi, or, all of the narrative that you are very familiar with. They really tried to put these targets on us as we are from the extreme left, because for them it's very comfortable to try to appeal to the center-left part of the ideological spectrum worldwide and say, well, we are confronting the right and the extreme right. Beware of them. No, we are not about the extreme right. We are about these very basic core issues that we are talking about. There are very important people in Latin America that come traditionally from the left that, of course, have been supportive. However, the regimes that today call themselves leftist regimes, and I can mention Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, they are all kind of the propagandists of Nicolás Maduro. So you have these regimes that call themselves progressive, that they talk about the environment, that they talk about human rights, but they are willing to stand beside a dictator that is being investigated for committing crimes against humanity for their own either political reasons or their kleptocratic or business reasons. And then there is the people of Latin America. I think if you poll the people of Latin America if Maduro should stay or leave, or if Ortega should stay or leave, you will have very large majority of the people that would be against Nicolás Maduro. So there is a challenge of not trying to put the problem in this perspective, because I hear sometimes arguments from the left trying to create a line of argument, of framing, kind of like giving, creating the conditions for the left-thinking people to be supportive of a cause as simple and clear, like the case of Venezuela or Cuba, Nicaragua, and many others. So it's a tough thing because that lens is there, that bias is always there. But I think we need to make an effort rather than to create the nuances that people love that word, to create the subtleties, kind of create the gray areas, is to present a different framework. You know, this is about democracy and human rights and free and fair elections.
For final question, I'm curious, what are you learning here? I understand kind of there are general things, you know, there are things in Ukraine, the activism, the anti-corruption fight, the something we progress. But really, what are the maybe interesting things you mentioned here while talking to the people during this visit, which are, I'm not saying eye-opening, but something which, you know, brings you some thoughts to develop further in your future? Because I understand it's a natural place for having friends and alliance in all the things, sanctions, bitcoins, other things. But what is interesting for you here while being and also learning?
No, many things. But one thing that really struck me is the livelihood and the spirit of Kyiv as a city. It's really shocking. If you are walking the streets of Kyiv or if you walk the streets of Paris, you would think that France is a country at war and not Ukraine.
And you says it as a mayor, as a former mayor.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, whenever I go to a city, I mean, I have the bias of looking, you know, the way if the city is clean or not, if public transportation works, you know, how the public lighting.
You didn't use probably proper public transportation. It's not very good, but anyways, no, it works.
Yeah,
it works.
But my point is that, but beyond the work of the city, that is really impressive, is the spirit of the people. That's my biggest takeaway. And then many other things, but the spirit of the people. My big takeaway is that Ukrainians are hopeful that they are going to win and become a much greater country than the one they are today, and that my sense is that you are making a great effort to build that today. So my sense is that we want to, you know, open our restaurants. We want to be in the streets. We want to record this podcast. We want to do things because normality is a way to fight back. Normality is a way to say, you are not going to conquer our hearts or behavior, and this is the way we want to live. We want to live as a free society and as a democratic society. And that's something I learned. You can only feel that if you come here.
You really, really, really got it. That's really the way of resistance. It's a bit schizophrenic because there is a risk, there is a tragedy, you know, it's always, but this idea that we go on, we don't stop because you want us to stop and we won't. That's what we do beyond everything.
I had the opportunity to talk to some soldiers yesterday, people who had been in the front lines, and I asked them about this. I said, you know, how do you feel going to the front line and coming back to Kyiv and the city being as it is now? And they said, you know, it's hopeful because that's what we are fighting for. And it's a way of the people resisting. It's a way of coming back, you know, to my house and being with my family and know that, yes, I'm making a sacrifice and taking risks, but they are living the life that we are fighting for.
Thank you for understanding and for coming. And I think it's just a very beginning. It's not even the very beginning. It's somewhere to go on. And I'm also very, very hopeful that, Ukrainians would be more engaged also in solidarity and support for Venezuelan cause. I had traveled once during the Maidan revolution, to Davos to tell the cause. And there was the days when the first people died in the Maidan. I wasn't at home, so it felt very bad. But I also had met some Venezuelans because they were also exactly the time. And we did this, like selfies with, I think I got a bracelet with Venezuelan signs and photos. And there was this pictures of solidarity. And Facebook has this nature to remind you every year, that there was this when I was making a photo for the Venezuelan cause with the hope. And I always felt guilty because I had no time to return. I hadn't time to ask, how are you? What's going on? And still, I feel kind of sad that I cannot find a way to relate to my Syrian friends, to my Egyptian friends. But I seem like this picture with the Venezuelans is in my head. But I still hope that we probably find a bit more time as long as we win, and we would remain definitely more devoted to the other causes.
No, thank you. And I am certain that Ukraine is going to win. It's a matter of time. And when you win, you are going to become a reference to many parts of the world. And I think that will be part of the responsibility of Ukraine to the rest of the world. And it's also going to be part of the new Ukraine. A global Ukraine, a Ukraine that has reached out to the hearts of billions of people around the world that will be wanting to learn more. And I think that the buildup of that new Ukraine is going to take a lot from the rest of the world. And I hope to come back many times.